Hello and welcome to our virtual presentation, brought to you by the Brock Dance Research Lab. Our session is entitled Educational Implications for Dancers as Athletes Within Community and University Contexts, Examining Dancer Identity, Training Experiences, and COVID Impacts. In this virtual presentation, you'll get to listen to 4 different presentations. I'm going to have each individual introduce themselves and let you know what they'll be focusing on. Melissa, over to you.
All right, so my name is Melissa Blackburn. I'm an MA candidate in the Child and Youth Studies Department at Brock University, and I'll be presenting some findings from a paper entitled Dance Participation and Self-Esteem Among Competitive Dancers, the Moderating Role of Autonomy Supportive Teaching.
I'm Dawn Zinga. I'm the director of the Brock Dance Research Lab and a professor in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Brock University. My presentation will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on competitive dancers and their families.
My name is Victoria Dewar, and I am an MA candidate in the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences, specializing in sport management here at Brock University. And my presentation will be focusing on convergences and divergences in competitive dance, the experiences of youth dancers across styles.
My name is Natalie Takuri, and I am a PhD student in the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill University. And my portion of the talk today will be looking at dancers' experiences as inter-university artists and athletes in Ontario.
Thank you for joining us for a virtual presentation, and we hope that you enjoy each of the talks.
All right, so as mentioned, my name is Melissa, and my portion of the talk will focus on examining the relationship between dance participation and self-esteem among young competitive dancers, with a focus on the moderating role of autonomy supportive teaching. So first, just a quick definition of self-esteem. Broadly, self-esteem can be defined as your own attitude towards yourself, including your evaluation of your own thoughts and feelings in relation to your sense of self. And I was particularly interested in self-esteem among dancers, given mixed findings surrounding the relationship between dance participation and self-esteem. So on the one hand, there's some evidence suggesting that participation in dance is actually linked with increased levels of self-esteem. So specifically that young people who participate in dance have higher levels of self-esteem compared to those who do not participate in dance. However, other research fails to find an association between dance participation and self-esteem. So this is both kind of currently, so among young people who are currently participating in dance, there tends to be no relationship, at least in some research. And in adults, self-esteem does not seem to be related to participation in dance as a young person or as a child. However, other studies have suggested that dance participation may be linked to decreased self-esteem at certain ages or in certain contexts. So with respect to age, Lovett, in a 2011 publication, found that levels of self-esteem related to the dance context specifically kind of started off high in early adolescence, but then decreased significantly as dancers kind of aged into mid-adolescence, suggesting that the adolescent years may be a particularly critical period with respect to dance participation and self-esteem. And then Van Zelst and colleagues found that dancers tended to rate their levels of self-esteem lowest in training contexts compared to performance contexts or to social contexts kind of outside of dance entirely. So these findings altogether point to the importance of examining A, the relationship between dance participation and self-esteem among young dancers, and B, examining moderating factors that may explain these discrepant findings, and particularly moderating factors related to the training context or the training environment that may influence self-esteem among young people. So one such factor is autonomy supportive teaching or coaching, which is an approach to coaching that allows for athletes and dancers' participation in decisions that affect their sport experiences. So this could be things like choreography for dancers, goal setting, kind of how the curriculum is laid out, the lesson plans for the day or for the week. And this coaching style emphasizes choice and voice among dancers, problem solving, and collaborative decision making, as well as an emphasis on constructive, competence-focused feedback. So why focus on autonomy supportive teaching in dance? Research suggests that higher levels of autonomy support in dance environments have been linked with a variety of positive outcomes, including positive affect, confidence, and enthusiasm for dance, as well as levels of self-esteem among dancers. whereas lower levels of autonomy support in dance environments have been linked with negative outcomes, including an increased risk of burnout. And then finally, a recent study has provided some preliminary evidence for the moderating role of autonomy support in dance contexts specifically. So this study found that autonomy support significantly moderated the relationship between subtypes of perfectionism and burnout among dancers, as well as engagement with dance, such that higher levels of autonomy support appeared to mitigate the risk of burnout among dancers with perfectionistic tendencies, and supported feelings of engagement with dance among these dancers as well. So kind of providing some evidence for the idea that autonomy supportive dancing environments can support more positive outcomes among dancers while mitigating the risk of kind of more maladaptive outcomes among dancers. So the current study aimed to examine the relationships between dance participation, autonomy supportive dance instruction, and self-esteem among young competitive dancers. And specifically, our research questions were: how is participation in dance linked with self-esteem among dancers? And do perceptions of autonomy supportive dance instruction moderate this relationship? So there were 425 competitive dancers in the current sample, and they were between the ages of 8 and 18 years old with an average age of about 11. All the dancers in our sample were female, and our sample was predominantly white. The dancers in our study completed survey measures on site at dance competitions before the onset of COVID-19. So this is all kind of pre-COVID data. Dancers filled out a variety of measures, including indicators of dance participation, including the number of hours they train per week, the number of performances they engage in per year, and whether or not they engage in additional training beyond kind of the normal curriculum at their dance studio, as well as measures of self-esteem and autonomy supportive dance instruction. So our results indicated that dance participation, so kind of the more they were engaged with dance, the lower their levels of self-esteem were. So kind of the more time they're spending in training context and the greater number of performances per year, altogether were linked with lower levels of self-esteem among the dancers in our study. On the other hand, autonomy supportive dance instruction, so feeling like they had a voice and a choice in their dance environment and their training context, was linked with more positive levels of self-esteem or higher levels of self-esteem. And then importantly, with respect to our research questions, autonomy supportive teaching did emerge as a significant moderator in the relationship between dance participation and self-esteem. So more specifically, follow-up analyses indicated that at low or average levels of autonomy support, so if we follow kind of the dotted line, so the one that starts off at the top on the left-hand side, or the middle one here, the dashed line, which represents average levels of autonomy support, we're seeing that negative relationship between dance participation and self-esteem. So at average and low levels of autonomy support, the more dancers are engaged in these kind of dance environments, the lower their levels of self-esteem tended to be. However, this relationship was actually reversed at high levels of autonomy support. So when dancers really feel like their teachers value their voices, opinions, involve them in decision making, they actually have higher levels of self-esteem the more they're engaged in those types of dance environments. So altogether, these results point to the key role of autonomy supportive dance instruction in fostering self-esteem among young competitive dancers. So specifically, it points to the need to really emphasize and focus on promoting autonomy supportive teaching styles in dance environments, given that even at average levels of autonomy support, we were seeing that negative relationship between dance participation and self-esteem. So it does appear to be critical to actively promote and foster feelings of autonomy support within dance training contexts in order to foster and promote self-esteem among our dancers. So specifically, some strategies dance teachers could use to promote or create more autonomy supportive contexts are allowing dancers to participate in decisions regarding choreography, when teaching new choreography or new technical skills, to offer suggestions rather than explicit instructions. So kind of starting off perhaps by demonstrating and then allowing dancers to experiment with the new skill or new choreography in ways that feel good in their body in ways that look good to them, allowing them to ask questions, to kind of seek out that feedback or to experiment for themselves. Further, dance teachers can make active efforts to involve dancers in both short and long-term goal setting. So this could be in the terms of the class, maybe the term, the program more broadly. If you're in a studio where kind of the dancers are intending to stay there until they graduate high school, kind of more long-term across years, what do they want to accomplish? What are their goals? What do they want to see themselves be able to do at the end of their dance experience? Or at the end of their dance experience within that particular training context. And then in situations where obviously you can't allow dancers to have as much input or to experiment. So for example, if there's kind of safety concerns when teaching a new technical skill, or if you're following a specific curriculum, so kind of there's specific objectives that you need to meet as a group, just explaining the reasoning behind these decisions with respect to technique and programming to the dancers, and really making sure that the rationale and reasoning is clear to them so they don't feel like that they're left out of the decision-making process and of the planning process for their own progress in dance. And then finally, dance teachers should aim to provide positive, competence-focused feedback. So rather than always focusing on what dancers are doing wrong, emphasize what they're doing right or what they changed, what made it better this time compared to last time. And along with this involves avoiding controlling statements, including emphasis on rewards and punishment. So in a dance context, this might look like, if you get your turns consistently, I'll put you in the front row, or on the flip side, if you can't get this turning combination consistently, you'll be moved to the back or you'll be taken off stage. So kind of avoiding those controlling statements, avoiding rewards and punishment, and really focusing on fostering feelings of competence and providing positive feedback to dancers. All right, thank you for listening. I have my references here if anyone wants to pause and check any of those out. But if not, I'll pass it over to Dawn, who will focus on training contexts among dancers in the COVID-19 pandemic.
Hello, and thank you for your virtual attendance. I'm going to be focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on competitive dancers and their families. Now, what we did was we put together a mixed methods approach that combined online surveys with virtual interviews. So the online surveys were completed by dancers and parents, and they included open response questions as well as scales related to well-being and attitudes towards dance. We also had some items related to their COVID experiences and studio experiences. The virtual interviews were more of a deep dive into what dancers were experiencing throughout COVID. We only interviewed dancers because the focus of this particular study was more so on the dancers themselves, although we did really want to look at the dancer-parent interactions. And so we did interviews at 3 time points following each survey completion. And as I mentioned, all of the interviews were virtual. Now, in terms of time points, time 1 went from May to November 2020. Time 2 ranged from December 2020 to April 2021. And time 3 was June 2021 and to November 2021. So as you notice, this is a longitudinal study. At each of the 3 time points, participants completed surveys, and then a subset of dancers completed virtual interviews. We're still in analysis stage with time 3, so this talk is going to focus on time 1 and time 2 only. Now, for our participants, the dancers were aged 10 to 18 years. We did have dancer-parent pairs. At time 1, we had 226 pairs. At time 2, we had 157 pairs, and at time 3, we had 135 pairs. As I mentioned, the dancers and their parents completed online surveys via Qualtrics. There was an optional dancer interview, and in the interview, we asked questions about the dance experiences during COVID, protocols at the studio, physical and mental health, and social interactions. And the interviews were designed to correspond to the surveys, and in particular to the open response questions. So on some of the questions, such as protocols and how dancers were feeling during COVID about dance itself, we also had open response that was coming from all of the dancers and parents. And so the data that you're about to see really combines all that together. Now, when we asked dancers about studio precautions and their parents, what we found was 95% of our participants indicated that social distancing was happening. 93% talked about frequent hand sanitizing. 76% talked about needing to do assessments of COVID-19 symptoms before entering the studio. 55% referred to temperature checks before entering the studio. 85% talked about limited access to common areas. 93% identified that face masks were required at the studio. 90% reported that they were dancing in 6x6 pre-marked squares. 95% spoke about how there were no longer parents and guardians allowed at the studio. 92% talked about sanitizing rooms and equipment between classes as a protocol, and 78% talked about reduced class sizes. So clearly dancers and their parents were experiencing differences in how they could access the studio when they were actually allowed to access the studio. Because of course, during our study, there were times when we were in full lockdowns and dancers were not allowed to access studio spaces at all. Now, we did look at changes over time between time 1 and time 2. And what we found and what dancers were reporting is that dancers were dancing fewer hours overall. It was also less important to dancers that they danced, and dancers were enjoying dancing less. Dancers were taking more additional training outside of regular classes, and it was less important for dancers to practice their routines. And if you just think for a minute about what was happening during COVID, most competitions were suspended, so dancers weren't able to compete. If they were able to compete, it was largely virtual. Sometimes they were in Zoom classes, sometimes their studios closed. So these findings really aren't that surprising given the amount of disruption that dancers were experiencing to their schedules. What was really interesting is that their feelings or interest in dance also shifted, but they didn't all shift in the same direction. So there was some heterogeneity among the dancers. So for some, they didn't notice a change. So my feelings of dance haven't changed, and I still have a huge passion about dance. Others found a decrease in how they were experiencing their dancing motivation. So I've been feeling a little less motivated because there are no competitions coming up soon. But for the most part, I still love dance. Some found that they were really reinvigorated. So if anything, my passion for dance has grown because it provides a distraction from other stressors in my life. It's made me feel more gratitude towards dance and made me realize how much I let go mentally when I dance. Some spoke specifically about Zoom. Yes, I did not enjoy dance on Zoom as it wasn't fun for me, or actual dancing. I felt very discouraged and it was hard to follow along. And yes, I find dance sometimes very boring because we can't touch, and it's just a different environment of dance now. So you can see dancers definitely experienced some changes in their attitudes when they were experiencing COVID. Now, what did parents have to say about how dancers were feeling? When we looked at first lockdown impacts, parents, 49% reported no change in their dancers' interest in dance. 25% reported that their dancers were less motivated or interested. 15% thought their dancers were more interested and valued dance more. And about 11% talked about mood shifts in dancers, with dancers being sad, seeming to be more down or worried. Now, when we looked about further into dancer interest, we found some interesting things. So dancers' interest has not changed, but our interest as a parent has. They also talked about enjoying the break and getting more family time. One parent spoke about how I've learned a lot about the dance industry, how studios and competitions are run and regulated in comparison to other youth activities. This comment seems to refer to some of the challenges that parents experienced when competitions were closed, but competition fees were not necessarily refunded, but moved to the next competition season, and no one knew when that was. And so parents seem to be looking a little bit more into how everything worked and comparing it to other activities. Now, the three main themes that came out in this area was that they were definitely enjoying more family time. So one of the things we noticed about lockdowns is that they offered a chance to enjoy more family time and a break from busy schedules and demands, which leads into our other major themes of other interests and reprioritizing. So some dancers started pursuing other activities and reassessing how they prioritize dance. So lockdowns actually interrupted their schedules and gave them a chance to take a pause and really reassess what they could access, how they could access it, and how they wanted to spend their time. Online Zoom classes were another big theme. What we found here was that dancers and parents spoke about how they were great to keep everyone connected, but that they weren't really effective as a vehicle for training or encouraging motivation in training. So they were less happy with the actual content or training of dance, but they liked getting together with fellow dancers and connecting and keeping those connections going. Now, when we move from first to second lockdown in the data, and we look at shifting interests, parents definitely reported that dancers preferred face-to-face classes over Zoom, but were frustrated by the unpredictability of pandemic conditions and restrictions. So it was hard to be motivated without goals such as competition and performances. So even when studios opened, sometimes they were late in opening, waiting to see if the regulations were really going to settle. Sometimes they opened for a bit, but then we had to go back into another lockdown. It depended on area for some. But there was very little information about competitions and performances other than a few virtual opportunities. So when we look at time 1 to time 2, there was no change. So you see more no change reported in time 1, a little less in time 2. In time 1, we did get less motivated, and that increased in time 2 in terms of percentage. Time 1 and time 2 increased interests were very similar, and there were more mood changes in time 1 than there were reported in time 2. Now, as we came out of a lockdown, what were parents saying about how they were feeling about sending their dancers back to studio? So about 54% of the parents were confident in the protocols put in place by the studios and communicated to them. 19% were worried about compliance, so how the protocols would be enforced and how others would follow those protocols. 14% were afraid of the potential increased risk of exposure for their dancer, and 8% of parents expressed this kind of generalized fear of the unknown, like that they were sending their dancer back into the world when they didn't really understand a post-lockdown world as well as they would have liked to. Now, what else did parents have to say? Many of them were very happy with their studio. So our studio put so much effort into keeping our kids safe. They talked about motivation. So the spark was reunited in September when the studio opened. And he realized how happy he was to be back in rehearsals and the energy created when they're together in the same room and the magic of teamwork happens. There are also 3 main themes that came up here. So mental health, many parents spoke about how hard pandemic conditions were on the dancers and how much they needed to get back into face-to-face training and really get off Zoom for training. They also spoke about loss and grief, so that over both time periods, parents spoke about what dancers had lost, whether it was the competition season, not being able to connect with friends, other opportunities for workshop or performance, and final seasons for dancers who were senior dancers and have been looking forward to like their final competitive season. And the difficulty in grieving these losses, so both in the losses being recognized and the dancer being given space to really grieve those losses. Quitting dance also came up. So we had 3 of our dancers quit by time point 2, and parents spoke about dancers losing interest in considering quitting a lot more than they might see otherwise. And some struggled with the changes to dance and the loss of competition. So they really felt that loss of being able to compete. So what strategies did we identify coming out of this pandemic and helping dancers cope. Really for parents listening and talking with their dancer to find out what their priorities are, what might help. If there's things that they're grieving that they want to talk about, changing it up and trying some student choreography or adding improv to the mix in training classes, whether those are Zoom or face-to-face. A lot of dancers spoke about how one-on-one training with a favorite teacher during lockdowns and restricted periods that focused on what the dancer chose was really helpful. And one of the really key ones was to set some realistic goals to work towards. So dancers are very goal-oriented. So just because competition is complicated doesn't mean that they can't strive for other goals. So thank you very much for listening. As Melissa mentioned, this study included what we call general competitive, as well as Highland and Irish dancers. And the study that you're going to hear about next, that we refer to as the style study, was created because those dancers came to us and wanted to be included with the general competitive dancers. So Irish and Highland stressed that they were also competitive dancers. And so Victoria is going to talk to you about what we found in that study. Thanks again.
Hi, my name is Victoria Dewar, and I'll be presenting on our study titled Convergences and Divergences in Competitive Dance, the Experiences of Youth Dancers Across Styles. Allow me to introduce you to our study, focused on dancers across competitive dance styles. When we created this study, we asked ourselves, if dancers from so many styles are competing, where are the convergences and divergences amongst the different styles? This is where our study began. From April to June 2021, 41 dancers were interviewed for the study, including 13 general competitive dancers, which includes those who compete in the styles of jazz, ballet, tap, etc., 15 Highland competitive dancers, and 13 Irish competitive dancers. Of the 41 dancers interviewed, 39 identified as female, 1 as male, and 1 did not specify. The average age of our dancers was 14.4 years old, with the youngest being 11 years old and the oldest being 19 years old. Each of our participants resided in the province of Ontario in Canada. The overarching research question for this study was, what are the convergences and divergences in dancers' experiences across general, Highland, and Irish styles of competitive dance? This presentation will focus on 4 main areas: levels of parental involvement, studio and school experiences, experiences at competitions, and attitudes around dance. We'll focus on how these are similar or different across the styles of general competitive dance, Highland competitive dance, and Irish competitive dance. When it comes to dancers' relationships and experiences with parents, we'll look at the dancers' relationships and experiences with their own parents. Across all styles, more dancers discuss their parents having an average level of involvement rather than being very involved. One participant discussed their parents' average level of involvement by saying, "I think that I enjoy the level of involvement, and I think that's really helpful, and more when it comes to my mom. If she wasn't as involved and if she didn't push me, then I wouldn't be practicing every day because I don't enjoy practicing, but I know I have to do it. And if it wasn't for her, then I probably wouldn't be as good of a dancer as I am now." One participant discussed their parents being very involved by saying, "In terms of dance preparation, my mom was very involved, so she would make sure the night before we leave or the day before we leave if we were going to a hotel. She would make sure everything was organized. Like, there's a lot of things you have to remember for competitions, I'm sure you know. So like, even the smallest details, like bobby pins, that sort of thing. Like, she would make sure all that stuff was ready and I would just be in my own world. Like, hopefully she doesn't forget anything." Across all styles, there was more discussion of the dancer's mom's involvement in their dance experience than dad's involvement. It is also interesting to note that while dancers often talked about their own parents' involvement as being just right or average, they often talked about other parents being very or overly involved. We also asked dancers what their parents expected from them in dance. The following 3 expectations were mentioned most by dancers. Many dancers talked about their parents expecting them to do their best. One of our participants who competes in Irish dance said, "They just want me to do the best as I can. If they feel like I don't try as hard, they'll be okay with it, but they would rather me put in as much effort as I can." Many dancers also talked about how their parents expect them to practice and work to improve. One of our participants who competes in Irish dance said the following when talking about what their mom expects of them. She does also try to make sure that I'm practicing on other days when I don't have dance. She lets me take Saturday as a day off, but she does want us to practice on other days. Lastly, many dancers talked about their parents wanting them to have fun and enjoy dance. One general competitive dancer said, "They're just about if I have fun or if I enjoy it. Like my mom always says, whenever I want to stop dance, I can stop. Only if I enjoy it, they're happy." When it comes to how dancers are supported by their parents, many dancers touched on their parents' financial support, driving them to and from dance classes or competitions, and being in attendance at their competitions. Let's touch now on dancers' studio or school experiences. When we ask dancers to describe their studio or school, the following two themes stand out as being a convergence across all styles. These themes are a supportive and welcoming environment and a family-oriented studio or school with a family feel. One of our participants described their studio's supportive and welcoming nature by saying, "And even just the other girls in this school, they are so welcoming and they're willing to, be there and support you and your goals, even if you are competing in the same age group against each other." One of our participants described their studio's family feel by saying, "I would just say that we're a family and everyone gets along. We're really just close and happy. And yeah, we really value that." While another said, "I would say we're a very small, tight-knit community. There's always going to be someone there to pick you up if you're having a bad day." It's important to highlight that dancers seem to value supportive teachers, support from teammates, both inside and outside of dance contexts, and the sense of community within their studios. Another point of interest is that dancers' passion and love for dance is evident in the way they describe their studios. Lastly, there's not much variation between general, Highland, and Irish competitive styles when discussing their studio or school experiences. Within the dance studio or school environment, there is discussion of drama and politics. During our interviews, we asked dancers what their experience with drama and politics was like. There were three main areas where drama and politics were highlighted: within the studio or school, between studios or schools, and in competition. When it comes to drama within the studio or school and between studios or schools, the areas highlighted on this slide are common across all styles. Drama and politics in competition varies across style, as it was very prominent and highly commented on by Irish dancers, prominent within Highland dancers, but only somewhat discussed by general competitive dancers. To emphasize this, one Irish dancer stated, "I think it's a very political world. It's a lot of what Irish dance is about, is who you know, who you're friends with, just a lot of it is connections." Next, we'll focus more on dancers' experience at competitions. One of the biggest differences across styles when it comes to competition are how the dancers compete in these styles. In general competitive dance, competing in groups is the priority, and studios often only attend competitions altogether. Highland and Irish dance differ here, as they are more individually focused when it comes to competing, and dancers have the opportunity to choose or be given permission to attend other competitions outside of the ones the whole school attends. When we asked dancers what it was like to compete in groups, general competitive dancers spoke about the support of teams and team members, not being centered out on stage because you're competing as a team, so the judges may not notice your mistake, and that a team pushes them to improve. One general competitive dancer said, "I do feel a little more comfortable in group dances, just because I feel comfortable having my teammates around me and doing a group with them." When we asked dancers what it's like to compete individually, most of the dancers spoke of control and relying on themselves. They also spoke about not letting others down if they make a mistake, being able to improv if they make a mistake, and not being pulled down or impacted by other people's errors. One Irish dancer said, "It's pretty cool, I guess. It's cool because then there's nobody else that if you mess up, nobody's actually going to notice because they don't know your steps." When it comes to competing, we asked dancers about their experiences competing against other studios and schools, as well as competing against their friends or people they train with. When we asked about their experiences competing against other studios and schools, dancers across styles touched on enjoying the chance to see what other studios, schools, and dancers do. Dancers across styles also touched on how it's fun to have competition. One general competitive dancer said, instead of just going up against your score from last time, it's nice to have another group to compete against. Additionally, across styles, many dancers touched on how competition doesn't bother them, or they are used to it now that it does not impact them. When we asked about their experiences competing against their friends or people they train with, many dancers across all styles touched on how they are always supportive of one another, even when competitors. One Highland dancer said, "To me, I personally don't care if someone at my own studio beats me. I'm not going to be jealous over it. I'm going to be proud of that person, and I'm just going to work harder to beat them, and I expect the same of them." Many dancers also touched on the jealous or competitive nature that can arise when competing against friends. Across styles, dancers also touched on how they viewed competing against their friends to be no different than competing against others. One Highland dancer said, "I mean, it's like the same as usual, except you know them. It's the same except you want them to win, but you also want to win at times." Another area of competition that we asked dancers about was judging. When we asked dancers what they think about the judges and how they are judged at competition, dancers talked about judges having a style preference or approach. Across styles, dancers spoke of judges having different dance backgrounds or training that influenced what they liked or valued in dance performances at competitions. One general competitive dancer said, "I think every judge is different in their own way, but also the same, so they're different because every judge is different in the way that some judges might not like tap or might like ballet, because they might be a ballet dancer. So if you do a tap routine, they might judge a little harsher on that or might not know as much, so they might be a little easier on you about it." Dancers also spoke of bias and potential favoritism. Within competitive dancers, the bias tended to be around judge preference or dance style. This also occurred in Highland and Irish dancers as well, but they tended to speak more about favoritism towards studios and specific dancers. One Irish dancer stated, "I think it's pretty biased because every judge has their own school, their own style. So just because you're not necessarily that good with like technique, or no, there's like a specific technique that you're not as good with, but you're good at something else. But that judge may not like what you are good at, but they may notice what you're not good at." It's important to note that not all dancers agreed that there was bias, and many believed the judging was fair. Towards the end of our interviews, we asked dancers several questions about the attitudes towards dance that they experience. One question we asked was, "What are your friends like when you can't do things because of dance?" Across all styles, dancers touched on their friends being understanding, used to it or planning around it, or being disappointed. When it comes to being understanding, one general competitive dancer said, "They completely understand, which I really appreciate. Like they don't overreact at all, which is good." We also asked dancers about what they think other people in society thinks about dance. Across all styles, dancers touched on how society is unknowledgeable about dance, they see dance as easy, and they don't recognize or respect dance. When discussing society's lack of knowledge, one Highland dancer said, "I think in the dance world, obviously we think it's a sport and it's an art. But I feel like outside of the dance world, they probably don't really think all that much about it. Like a lot of people don't realize how much goes into dance, like especially the choreography, perfecting the choreography, storytelling, like it takes a lot." When discussing dance being seen as easy, one general competitive dancer stated, "I feel like most people think it's easy, but honestly, I don't think they could do it. Like it's a lot harder than people think." Lastly, when talking about the general public not recognizing or respecting dance, one Irish dancer said, "Irish dancing is seen as a lot more traditional. And as much as I think we do have traditional aspects in our dancing, I feel like it's evolved to be much more than that. Where it's like we're trying out all of these crazy things, like jumping in the air. That doesn't get recognized as much." The following are implications that arise from this study. When it comes to levels of parental involvement, it's important for parents to negotiate the right level of involvement with their dancers and to renegotiate this involvement as years go by and as their dancers get older and become more independent. When looking at studio or school experiences, it's important for studio owners and teachers to continue to stress teamwork and support within the studio or school environment, as this is very highly valued by dancers. When it comes to competitions, it's important for competition directors and rule makers for various dance styles to continue to put rules in place to mitigate bias and favoritism in judging, as this was spoken about by many dancers. Finally, there is a need for more accurate representation of dance in media, including documentaries, TV shows, movies, etc., in order to shift society's attitudes towards dance, as dancers see the general public as being unknowledgeable about dance, seeing dance as easy, or that they don't recognize or respect dance. This concludes my portion of our colloquium presentation. To this point, we have touched on youth competitive dancers. In the next presentation, presented by Natalie Takuri, we will shift our focus to the post-secondary setting and touch on university-level competitive dancers. Take it away, Natalie.
Hi everyone, my name is Natalie Takuri, and the work that I'm going to be presenting today comes from my master's research conducted in the Department of Child and Youth Studies at Brock University. In this portion of our talk, I will be discussing dancers' experiences as inter-university artists and athletes in Ontario, Canada. I'm going to start by providing some background and context into the competitive dance scene in Ontario and explain how dancers progress from competing with a dance studio to competing with a university dance team. In Ontario, dancers typically begin competing with a local dance studio around the age of 6 and can continue until they graduate high school around the age of 18. When dancers enter university, most have the option to audition for a competitive dance team at their school and can continue competing for the next 4 to 5 years while they complete their undergraduate degree. The university-level competitive dance community in Ontario is made up of approximately 20 universities and 25 to 30 different dance teams, as some universities have more than one team. Dancers begin auditions and training in September and go all the way through to March, where they then compete at 2 to 3 competitions for the season. These competitions are independently run by industry professionals in the dance community and are not affiliated with any sort of sport or university organization. So prior to conducting this research, I was actually part of a university dance team myself and was already aware of the different ways that teams could be represented by their university. And I categorized these forms of representation into 3 different groupings. The first is what I call other or no representation. The second is student union representation, and the third is athletic department representation. And I'll be elaborating on these 3 groupings and what this means in terms of support for dance teams later in my talk. From my experience, I noticed that most teams were striving for representation by their athletic department, which ultimately came with recognition of dancers as student athletes and recognition of dance as a sport. With this elevated status, dancers were able to be recognized not only for their artistry, but also for the athleticism that many people fail to recognize. However, in striving for athletic department representation, I noticed over my years as a university-level dancer that more often than not, many teams failed to achieve this or spent years and years attempting to advocate for their sport recognition. And this is what inspired my master's research project, which aimed to answer the following 3 research questions. 1, do individuals in post-secondary contexts conceptualize dance as a sport, art, or combination of both? 2, are there differences in how individuals perceive dance with respect to contextual factors, previous exposure to dance, and key individual differences? And 3, do these differences occur as a result of the individual's role in the community? To answer these questions, I recruited 3 groups of participants from universities across Ontario. The first consists of competitive dancers, the second is competitive dance coaches, and the third is athletic department staff. Between myself and 3 research assistants, we conducted 27 semi-structured interviews with participants, which consisted of 11 dancers, 9 coaches, and 7 athletic department staff. The results I'm sharing today were chosen for this specific talk. If you're interested in a more comprehensive discussion of the results of this study, I share them in a paper presentation entitled Sport, Art, or Both: Examining Conceptualizations of Dance as a Sport in Ontario University Athletic Contexts.
In this talk, I'm going to start by briefly describing participants' insights into the benefits and challenges of each of the three types of representations for dance teams, and I'll then follow with a discussion of the institutional and systemic barriers that prevent dance teams from achieving full sport recognition. So dance teams who were represented by the athletic department had a direct affiliation with the university and were typically given sport club status. Participants revealed that they were unable to actually gain full varsity status because they didn't participate in competitions that were run by official governing bodies for university sport in Canada, such as U Sports or the OUA. And the reason they didn't participate in these competitions is simply because they don't exist for dancers as of right now. So with these limited opportunities to participate in athletic contexts, it was difficult for dancers to justify their want and their need to be represented by the athletic department. Next on the chart, dance teams who were represented by the student union, who were also directly affiliated with the university, but they weren't granted any sort of sport status as they were seen as solely a student-run club and often were not even considered to be a competitive team. So in this final form of representation, other or no representation at the bottom of the chart, dance teams were entirely student-run with no support and no affiliation from the university. So as you can see in the chart, dance teams with athletic department representation at the top here have the most access to sport-related resources and supports. And as you move further down the chart, you can see that there's less and less access to resources depending on the form of representation. In terms of challenges, dance teams with all three types of representation commonly struggled with securing practice space, securing adequate funding, and also securing transportation to competitions. Because of these challenges, dancers relied heavily on their own fundraising efforts to assist in paying for competition fees, costumes, and buses. And in terms of studio space, dancers either had to travel off campus to train in a dance studio, and more often than not, they actually danced in open spaces around the university, such as cafeterias and hallways, either really early in the morning before classes started or really late at night when most of them were complete. Generally, dancers and coaches without athletic department representation emphasized their feelings of disconnect from the university, which they described as disheartening and disappointing. Regardless of dance teams' forms of representation, why are dancers still not considered legitimate athletes? Of the 27 participants in this study, all but 2 indicated they viewed dance as both a sport and an art. However, despite their openness in allowing dance to occupy spaces in both sport and art, they discussed various institutional and systemic barriers that prevented dancers from gaining full sport recognition at the university level. So as you can see here on the slide, I broke these barriers down into 3 major areas. The first set of barriers comes from athletic departments themselves. Overall, athletic department staff were very transparent about their lack of understanding as to how dance functions as a competitive sport. They demonstrated a strong understanding of the artistic qualities of dance, but showed resistance when speaking of how dance might actually fit within their athletic department structure. Dancers and coaches, on the other hand, exhibited very clear frustrations with this lack of understanding, and also this lack of education that was available to athletic department staff, particularly the staff who were working directly with their team throughout the year. This challenge can also be attributed to the second set of barriers identified on this slide, university sport culture. Dancers and coaches felt very strongly about what they perceived to be a greater overall value and respect for men's sports in university, particularly with regards to men's basketball teams. And with the participants in dance being predominantly women, all 3 groups of participants spoke of this as a disadvantage to dancers who are attempting to gain sport recognition within a culture that values and supports men's sports disproportionately more than they do women's sports. And another major challenge within university sport culture centers around sport models and sport hierarchies. So all official university sports in Ontario are governed by Ontario University Athletics, or the OUA, which I mentioned briefly earlier, which is one of 4 conferences under the Canadian governing body for all university sports, which is U Sports. And as you can see here in the model on the slide, OUA sports are divided into 3 tiers, which participants described as impacting resource allocation, priority, popularity, and overall support. And this model also came as a disadvantage to dancers as they were struggling to fit within a sport hierarchy that was traditionally designed for them not to fit. And while some dance teams in this study were granted the opportunity to be represented by their athletic department, they reported a less than mentality when comparing themselves to other sports who fit very clearly within this sport model, particularly men's sports in the top tier of this model. The third and final barrier came from others' perceptions about competitive dance. Dancers and coaches discussed the ways in which dancers struggle to gain recognition as legitimate student athletes in their universities. They spoke of a lack of recognition for their successes at competitions, difficulty arranging academic accommodations for missed exams due to competition, and feeling the need to constantly prove their worth and value as student athletes. Some athletic department staff also acknowledged this frustration and connected it more broadly to society's or even the media's role in misrepresenting dancers as solely artists and not showcasing their athleticism. So what does this mean for dance teams, athletic departments, governing sport bodies, and Ontario universities moving forward? First, the results of this study point to the need for increased education and communication between competitive dance teams and the organizations representing them at their university. I noticed an evident disconnect between what dance teams expected and felt were necessary in terms of support throughout the year and what was actually feasible to provide to them. Second, the results repeatedly highlighted difficulties in categorizing dance as an art, sport, or both, and how this impacted dancers being recognized as legitimate student athletes. Because of this, I argue that a major paradigm shift is necessary to address the historical, traditional, and sociocultural ideologies preventing competitive dance teams from achieving recognition as a sport and dancers achieving recognition as student athletes. And finally, the participants in this study acknowledged the barriers that dancers face in engaging in athletic contexts. As of right now, as I mentioned earlier, dancers do not have the opportunity to participate in any official competitions or events held by governing sport bodies in Canada. Instead, competitions are independently run, and dance teams are also independently run by students. As such, I argue that a broader definition and understanding of sport is necessary to allow dancers to participate in athletic contexts in the same manner as other recognized athletes at the university level.
Thank you for listening to our presentations. At this point, we're going to go into a brief discussion and focus on the overall implications. Victoria is going to start us off with implication number 1.
Thanks, Dawn. So implication number 1 highlights the lack of understanding of dance, which is an overarching theme throughout our presentations. The media and society do not demonstrate and understand the complexities and uniqueness of the various competitive dance landscapes. While shows like Dance Moms and So You Think You Can Dance have shown glimpses of the competitive world, they are not an accurate representation of all that competitive dance is.
Implication 2 centers around the notion that research largely focuses on dance functioning as an art, activity, or hobby, but fails to consider how dance functions as a sport and how dancers may participate in athletic contexts as athletes themselves.
Implication number 3 highlights the importance of considering the influence of training and performance contexts when conducting research with dancers. Our results highlight how teaching styles, the COVID-19 pandemic, differing dance genres, and studio versus university level contexts have uniquely shaped the experiences of young dancers. Future research should continue to look at contextual factors that may influence the training and performance experiences of young people involved with dance at the competitive level.
And implication number 4 focuses on complexities within dance. So across our 4 studies, should have received a window into how complex dance can be both across styles, how competition works, how the judging functions, and how dancers navigate these complexities both within training, within their relationships, and how studios and teachers also may need to navigate those along with parents who are supporting their dancers through all of this. So it's very important that as we move forward with research in dance that we focus in on those complexities so that we don't lose that whole picture of what's happening for dancers and their families. We would also like to thank all of the dancers and their families who participated in our research. A special thank you to the competitions and the studios who supported our research. They were invaluable in achieving what we've achieved. Much of our dance research was funded by an Insight Development Grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Our work has also been generously supported by internal grants from Brock University and the Dean of Social Sciences discretionary grants. Thank you for attending our talk virtually, and we look forward to interacting with you on the discussion board.